Step out of the car. The voice was sharp, cold, with an edge of authority that made it clear there was no room for negotiation. She froze. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel as the red and blue lights danced across her rearview mirror. She knew this wasn't just another traffic stop. Now. The barked order snapped her out of her thoughts. She stepped out, raising her hands slightly, careful, calculated. The pavement under her heels felt uneven, and the eyes of the people watching from the park made her chest tighten. "What's this about, officer?" Her voice was steady, but the weight of the moment pressed against her ribs. The officer, tall, broad, and white, towered over her. His eyes flickered with something she had seen before, contempt. Identification. "It's in my purse, on the passenger seat." His eyes narrowed. "Step back." She obeyed. The crowd in the park had stopped pretending not to stare. The officer yanked open the car door and grabbed the purse, spilling its contents onto the ground. Lipstick. Keys. Wallet. The ID slid out and skidded across the asphalt. "Pick it up." She hesitated. "Excuse me." "You heard me. Pick it up." Heat surged through her veins. She bent down slowly, swallowing the anger burning her throat. The moment her fingers brushed the ID, his boot shoved her shoulder. She stumbled, barely catching herself before hitting the ground. What the hell was that? The officer's voice was sharp. "Watch your tone." She straightened, trying to calm her breathing. "I'm cooperating." "No, you're resisting." The words hit harder than the shove. The crowd murmured. A phone appeared, someone recording. "Put your hands on the hood." Her pulse pounded. "I haven't done anything wrong." "You're obstructing an investigation." "What investigation?" "Don't talk back to me." The shout echoed, and before she could react, his hand gripped her wrist. Pain exploded as he twisted her arm and forced her against the car. "Stop. You're hurting me. Stay down." His knee pressed against her legs, pinning her as the handcuffs snapped shut. Metal bit into her skin, sharp and cold. The whispers turned into shouts from the onlookers. "She didn't do anything. She's not resisting." But the officer didn't stop. He yanked her upright and shoved her toward the squad car. "You people think you can do whatever you want." Her eyes burned, but she refused to let the tears fall. "Not here. Not like this." "You people," she repeated, her voice shaking. "Yeah. Entitled. Arrogant. Always playing the victim." His words sliced deeper than the cuffs. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but she stayed silent. She knew better. She had to. Because he didn't know. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know what she was capable of. And he sure as hell didn't know what was about to happen next. As the car door slammed shut behind her, the weight of humiliation settled in her chest. But it wouldn't last. Not for long. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. What happens when the person you try to break is the one who has the power to break you? Stay until the end to find out. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in all forms. We believe in equality, respect, and fairness for everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background. To every black viewer watching this video, we see you, we hear you, and we support you. This story is a powerful reminder of resilience, justice, and standing up against prejudice. We hope it resonates with you and inspires strength and courage. Enjoy the story, and if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more impactful narratives. Let's dive in. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the stretch of green that framed the small neighborhood park. The air was warm, humming with the sounds of children's laughter and distant conversations. It was the kind of place where people came to unwind, to feel safe. That illusion shattered the moment the police cruiser pulled to a stop near the curb. Danielle Carter had parked her sleek black sedan only minutes earlier. She had chosen this spot deliberately, close enough to the playground where mothers gathered with their kids but far enough from the noise to sit quietly with her thoughts. Her life rarely allowed moments like this. Moments to exhale. She was always moving, always working. At 32, Danielle had spent the last 8 years climbing the ranks of federal law enforcement. Her job demanded excellence, and she delivered. Few people in her field could match her discipline or her instincts. She had worked too hard to let distractions slow her down. But today was different. Today, she needed air. She sat on the park bench, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Her suit jacket was folded neatly beside her, leaving her crisp white blouse visible, sharp lines and clean cuts that said professionalism without apology. Even off duty, Danielle carried herself like someone with authority, someone who didn't back down. The hum of an engine broke her focus. She glanced up, spotting the black and white police car as it eased into the lot. A figure stepped out, heavy boots landing hard against the pavement. Officer Rick Dawson. She didn't know his name then, but she noticed everything about him, the broad shoulders, the squared jaw, the mirrored sunglasses that hid his eyes. He walked like he owned the ground beneath his feet. Danielle barely gave him a second thought at first. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She wasn't breaking any laws. But something shifted the moment his gaze locked on her. Rick Dawson had been a cop for 11 years. Long enough to feel like he understood people the moment he saw them. He saw the world in categories, good or bad, threat or harmless. Danielle didn't fit neatly into any of those boxes. To him, she was an anomaly. She looked expensive, like someone who didn't belong here. The car, the clothes, the posture, they all set off alarms in his head. He didn't like questions he couldn't answer. And when he couldn't find answers, he made assumptions. Rick had grown up in this neighborhood. He'd spent his childhood playing on this very grass, running up and down these sidewalks. Now, as a cop, he saw it through a different lens, one that made him hyper-aware of who was moving in and out. He told himself it wasn't about race. It was about order. About keeping the peace. But deep down, Rick had learned to let suspicion guide him, especially when it came to people who didn't look like him. Danielle caught his eyes lingering on her. She straightened, forcing herself to stay calm. She had been in situations like this before, men with badges who saw her skin before they saw her as a person. It was never easy, but she had learned how to diffuse tension. Rick, however, wasn't looking to be diffused. Danielle stood, gathering her things, hoping to leave before the encounter escalated. But the moment she stepped toward her car, he called out. "Hold it right there." She turned slowly, measuring her words. "Is there a problem, officer?" He walked closer, boots crunching against the gravel path. "What are you doing here?" Danielle raised an eyebrow. "Sitting in a public park." Rick's lips pressed into a thin line. "This is a family area. We've had complaints about strangers hanging around, making people uncomfortable." Her chest tightened, but she kept her voice even. "I'm not bothering anyone." His eyes flicked to her car, then back to her. "Is that your vehicle?" "Yes." He didn't believe her. She could see it in the way his shoulders squared, in the way his hand drifted closer to his belt. License and registration. Danielle knew this game. Knew how it worked. She could have ended it there, flashed her badge and shut him down. But something in her hesitated. She wasn't ready to let him off the hook. "Not yet." "It's in my car," she said. "I'll get it." Rick didn't move. "Step away from the vehicle." She froze. "Excuse me." "Step away. Hands where I can see them." A few people had started to notice. Danielle saw them watching, saw the phones coming out. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to breathe. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding." His voice hardened. "I said step back." She obeyed, but her patience was wearing thin. Rick opened the car door, rummaging through her things. He wasn't looking for papers. He was looking for something, anything, to justify his suspicion. When he couldn't find it, his frustration boiled over. "You think you're better than me?" Danielle's eyes snapped to his. "What? Walking around here like you own the place. Like the rules don't apply to you." She bit back the urge to shout, to push back. Instead, she said, "I don't know what you're talking about." Rick's hand closed around her arm. Hard. "You're under arrest." "For what?" "Obstruction." Her heart hammered as he spun her around, pressing her against the hood of her car. "You're making a mistake," she hissed. "No," he said, tightening the cuffs. "You did." The crowd had grown. Murmurs rippled through it. Cameras recorded. Danielle's chest burned with humiliation, with anger. But even as she sat in the back of his squad car, staring out at the people who couldn't look away, one thought kept circling in her mind. He didn't know who she was. Not yet. And when he found out, the fallout would be bigger than anything he'd ever imagined. The police cruiser rattled slightly as it navigated the narrow streets leading away from the park. Danielle Carter sat rigid in the back seat, her wrists stinging from the tightness of the handcuffs. The thin metal dug into her skin, a reminder of the humiliation she had just endured. The air inside the car felt heavy, suffocating. It carried the faint smell of sweat, stale coffee, and worn leather, making her stomach churn. Through the darkened windows, the shapes of people still standing by the park blurred as they faded into the distance. Phones had been raised, faces had stared, and whispers had spread like wildfire. She could only imagine the stories already forming in their minds. Danielle's reflection stared back at her in the glass. Her hair, usually perfect, was slightly out of place from being shoved against the hood of her car. Her blouse, crisp and white when she left her house that morning, now had faint smudges from Dawson's rough handling. But it wasn't the physical state that bothered her the most, it was the way she felt inside. A boiling mixture of humiliation, anger, and disbelief churned within her, but she bit her tongue and kept her face still. She wouldn't give Dawson the satisfaction of seeing her break. From the driver's seat, Officer Rick Dawson sat tall, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The tension radiated from him, filling the space with an unspoken hostility. He didn't even glance back at her, but Danielle could see his eyes in the rearview mirror. Hidden behind dark sunglasses, they flickered nervously every time he came to a stop sign or light. Danielle finally broke the silence. "Where are you taking me?" Her voice was firm, steady, but it carried the edge of someone who refused to be intimidated. Dawson's lips barely moved as he replied, "You don't get to ask questions." Danielle inhaled sharply, pressing her back against the seat. "I have rights." The faintest smirk crept across Dawson's face, but he didn't turn around. "You people always say that." Danielle's jaw clenched. "You people. You know exactly what I mean." His voice hardened. "Think you're above the rules. Think the law doesn't apply to you." Danielle leaned slightly forward, her wrists burning against the metal cuffs. "I didn't do anything wrong." Dawson slammed the brakes at a stoplight, causing her to lurch forward. The seatbelt pressed into her chest, knocking the air from her lungs. He turned halfway in his seat, finally meeting her eyes through the mirror. "Not yet." The light turned green, and he sped forward without another word. Danielle's heart pounded as the station came into view. It was small, worn down, and surrounded by a cracked parking lot with faded lines. A crooked sign above the entrance read Eastfield Police Department. Dawson pulled around to the back, avoiding the main doors where civilians might see them. When he stepped out of the car, Danielle hesitated, but he yanked the door open and motioned for her to get out. Move. Her legs felt stiff as she stood, but she forced herself to stay balanced. Dawson grabbed her arm, this time without the unnecessary aggression he'd shown earlier, but still firm enough to remind her who was in charge. She let him guide her inside, her heels clicking against the tile floors. The reception area was dimly lit, with old fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. A woman behind the desk barely looked up, her fingers tapping lazily at a keyboard. Danielle's sharp eyes scanned every detail, the peeling paint, the half-empty coffee cups on the desks, the paperwork scattered carelessly. Dawson led her past the rows of desks to a smaller room that reeked of disinfectant and stale air. He shoved her into a chair and stood over her, clipboard in hand. Name. Danielle didn't answer. Name. She stared straight ahead, lips pressed tight. Dawson's pen tapped against the clipboard. You think this is a game? She finally looked up, her eyes sharp. No. But I think you're playing with fire. Dawson's jaw twitched, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stood and motioned for a younger officer to step closer. The man couldn't have been more than 25, clean-cut and nervous, his eyes darting between Danielle and Dawson. Watch her, Dawson barked, handing him the clipboard before disappearing through a side door. Danielle sat back in the chair, her hands resting awkwardly in her lap. The cuffs pressed into her skin, but she didn't let her discomfort show. Instead, she focused on the young officer, who kept shifting uncomfortably. So, he started awkwardly, what's this about? Danielle's eyes didn't waver. You tell me. He looked down at the clipboard, flipping through a few pages. It just says obstruction. Her lips curled slightly. Obstruction of what? Before the officer could respond, Dawson returned, his steps heavy and deliberate. Enough, he snapped. Let's move this along. Danielle was pulled to her feet again. This time, she didn't resist, but she locked eyes with Dawson as he led her down a narrow hallway. Voices carried from the nearby offices, but they quieted as she passed. She could feel their stares through the blinds, their whispers trailing behind her. The cell at the end of the hall was smaller than she expected, with gray walls and a bench bolted to the floor. Dawson pushed her inside, slamming the door behind her. You're gonna regret this, Danielle said quietly, her voice steady. Dawson leaned against the bars, arms crossed. I don't think so. Danielle stepped closer, narrowing the space between them. You should. His confidence flickered, just for a moment. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the cell. Danielle sat down, her mind racing. She traced the details of the room, searching for anything she could use to her advantage. The cameras. The shadows outside the door. The faint hum of the ventilation system. Meanwhile, the world outside the station was already shifting. The video of her arrest had made its way online, sparking anger and questions. Strangers were demanding answers. Who was she? Why had she been treated this way? And what would happen next? But inside that cell, Danielle wasn't worried. She knew something Dawson didn't. She knew the moment he found out, everything he thought he knew about control, power, and justice would shatter. And when it did, it wouldn't just destroy him. It would change everything. The sharp, metallic click of the lock echoed in the dimly lit cell as Officer Rick Dawson stepped inside. The door scraped shut behind him, sealing the narrow space with a suffocating finality. The tension between him and Danielle Carter seemed to thicken with every passing second. She sat motionless on the hard bench, her back straight, her wrists still bound by the steel cuffs that had already left faint red marks against her skin. Despite her restrained position, there was no sign of defeat in her eyes. Instead, her gaze was sharp, unyielding, a quiet storm building beneath the surface. Dawson took a step closer, his heavy boots thudding against the concrete floor. He wanted her to flinch, to shrink back, to show even the smallest crack in her composure. But she didn't move. She didn't so much as blink. And that was what unsettled him most. He cleared his throat and folded his arms across his chest, forcing himself to tower over her. "We're gonna have a little chat." Danielle raised an eyebrow, her expression calm but piercing. "I think you've already said enough." His lips twisted into a smirk, but there was no real confidence behind it. "Oh, we're just getting started." Her eyes never left his, and the silence that followed stretched long enough to make him shift his weight. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low but cutting. "You picked the wrong person." Dawson snorted and stepped even closer, towering over her as if the sheer force of his presence could intimidate her into submission. "Is that what you think? You think this little act is gonna scare me?" Danielle's stare didn't waver. "No," she said quietly. "But what's about to happen will." For the first time, Dawson hesitated, his smirk faltering just enough for her to notice. He recovered quickly, masking the flicker of doubt with a tight grip on his authority. "You think you're somebody special?" He scoffed, shaking his head. "You're just another loudmouth who doesn't know when to keep quiet." She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady and deliberate. "And you're just another coward hiding behind a badge." That hit its mark. Dawson's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. "Watch your mouth." Danielle didn't flinch. "Or what? You'll hit me? You'll add assault to your list of mistakes tonight?" He leaned in closer, his voice a growl. "You don't scare me." "You should be scared," she shot back, her words sharp and controlled. "Because you're not in control anymore." Dawson took a step back, but his hand instinctively rested on the edge of his belt, the weight of the gun holstered at his side grounding him. "You're bluffing." Danielle stood slowly, her posture deliberate, even with the cuffs biting into her wrists. "No, I'm not." The room seemed to shrink as the tension thickened. Dawson's eyes darted briefly to the door, as if calculating his options. But Danielle wasn't finished. "You've already made the biggest mistake of your career," she said, her voice razor-sharp. "You didn't bother to check who I am." Dawson's smirk returned, but it wavered at the edges. "Who you are?" He let out a forced laugh. "You're nobody." Danielle stepped closer, her expression unwavering. "You might want to double-check that." His face darkened. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" She leaned in just enough for her voice to drop, calm but heavy with meaning. "Call dispatch. Run my ID again. And this time, pay attention to the words Federal Bureau of Investigation." Dawson froze. His eyes locked on hers, searching for any sign of deception. When he didn't find it, his shoulders stiffened. "You're lying. Try me." The challenge hung between them, and for the first time, Dawson didn't look so sure of himself. He grabbed his radio, his hands unsteady as he pressed the button. "Dispatch," he said, his voice tighter than before. "Run an urgent ID check." Static crackled, and then came the reply. "Confirming ID of Danielle Carter." "Yes." The pause that followed seemed to stretch forever, but when the dispatcher's voice returned, it shattered the room. "She's FBI." The words hit Dawson like a punch to the gut. He staggered back a step, his grip tightening around the radio as if holding onto it could undo what he'd just heard. "Say that again." "She's FBI," the voice repeated. "Badge number checks out. Do you need assistance?" Dawson's face drained of color. He turned back to Danielle, but the confidence in his posture had completely vanished. Danielle didn't let him finish. "You didn't ask questions. You didn't stop to think. You just saw me and decided I didn't belong." Dawson swallowed hard. "I didn't know," "No," she snapped. "You didn't. And now it's too late." The door burst open before he could respond, and two more officers stepped inside, one of them the captain. His eyes scanned the room quickly, landing on Danielle. "Get those cuffs off her," he barked. Dawson hesitated. "Now," the captain roared. Dawson scrambled to unlock the cuffs, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the key. The moment the metal fell away, Danielle rubbed her wrists, her eyes locked on him. The captain turned to Dawson, his voice sharp. "Badge and weapon. Hand them over." "No, wait, now." Dawson's hands trembled as he unhooked his badge, setting it down with an audible clink. Danielle stepped closer, her voice calm but deadly. "You thought you could humiliate me and walk away. You thought no one would believe me." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "But the world's already watching. And they're going to see everything." Dawson's face crumbled as the weight of her words sank in. The captain motioned for two officers to take him out of the room, and Danielle stood silently as he was led away. But it wasn't over, not yet. Outside the station, cameras flashed and microphones pointed toward her. The video of her arrest had already gone viral. And as she stepped out into the flood of questions and lights, Danielle Carter knew one thing for sure: this was just the beginning. Dawson's footsteps echoed down the hall as the two officers led him away, his shoulders hunched and his head hanging lower with each step. The weight of humiliation pressed against him, suffocating and inescapable. Danielle stood motionless, watching him disappear through the doorway. Her hands trembled slightly as she rubbed her wrists, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the fire still burning inside her, the kind of fire that refused to be extinguished. The captain shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Danielle and the empty doorway where Dawson had just been taken. "Agent Carter," he began, his voice cautious, measured. "I need to apologize for—" Danielle raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "Not now." He flinched but nodded, stepping back. She wasn't ready for apologies. Not yet. Not when the echoes of Dawson's words were still ringing in her ears. Danielle turned, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor as she made her way out of the holding area and into the main hallway. Heads turned as she passed, whispers trailing behind her like shadows. Some officers looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Others stared, their curiosity barely concealed. She ignored them all. As she reached the front desk, the young officer who had guarded her earlier stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his coffee. "Agent Carter," he stammered, his face pale. She stopped, her gaze sharp. "What's your name?" Officer Thompson, ma'am." "Thompson." She let the name hang in the air for a moment, her tone calm but firm. "Do you know what just happened here?" He swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am." "Do you?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Because what just happened wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. It was targeted. And it could have ended very differently." Thompson's throat bobbed as he nodded quickly. I'm sorry. You should have stepped in," she interrupted. "You should have said something. But you didn't. And now, you're part of it." He opened his mouth to respond, but she didn't give him the chance. "I hope you remember this moment, Thompson. Because I promise you, I won't forget it." Her words hit him like a slap, and for a second, he looked like he might cry. But Danielle didn't stay to watch. She turned and walked out the front doors, her breath hitching slightly as the cool night air hit her skin. Outside, the parking lot was chaos. Reporters crowded the entrance, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. The video of her arrest had already spread, and the media was hungry for answers. Danielle stopped at the edge of the steps, letting the noise wash over her. Questions flew at her from every direction. "Agent Carter, what happened inside? Was this a racially motivated incident? Is Officer Dawson going to face charges? Are you pressing charges?" Danielle raised a hand, and the crowd quieted just enough for her voice to carry. "I can't answer questions right now," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But I will say this, what happened to me tonight is not unique. It's not rare. And that's exactly why it has to stop." The murmurs rose again, but she didn't wait to hear more. She turned and walked toward her car, the weight of the night finally catching up to her. Her hands shook as she gripped the door handle, but she forced herself to breathe. Suddenly, a voice called out behind her. "Danielle." She turned sharply, her eyes narrowing as she saw Dawson standing at the far end of the parking lot. His hands were no longer cuffed, but two officers flanked him, their eyes fixed on him warily. Danielle squared her shoulders. "What do you want?" He stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate. "Just listen to me." Her jaw tightened. "Why should I?" "Because I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't know who you were. I swear." "That's the problem, Dawson," she shot back. "You didn't know. You didn't bother to find out. You just saw me, and that was enough." His face crumpled, and for the first time, he looked truly broken. "I messed up." Danielle's eyes burned, but she refused to let the tears fall. "You did more than mess up. You abused your power. You humiliated me. And you would have ruined my life if I hadn't had the means to fight back." He took another step closer, his voice desperate. "I'm not a bad person." She laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and hollow. "No. What do you think would have happened if I wasn't FBI? If I didn't have connections? What do you think happens to people who don't have the resources to defend themselves?" He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Danielle stepped closer, her voice low but firm. "You don't get to play the victim here. Not after what you did." "I'm sorry," he whispered. Her eyes locked onto his. "You're sorry because you got caught." The officers flanking Dawson shifted uneasily, but Danielle didn't back down. "This doesn't end here," she said, her voice steady. "There's going to be an investigation. There's going to be accountability. And you're going to have to face every single consequence of your actions." Dawson swallowed hard, his face pale. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." Danielle tilted her head. "Good. Then start by owning what you did." He looked down, his shoulders slumping under the weight of her words. Danielle turned without another word, sliding into her car and starting the engine. As she pulled out of the parking lot, the reporters swarmed again, but she didn't stop. Her hands gripped the wheel tightly, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The night wasn't over, and neither was the fight. But for the first time, she felt the tide beginning to turn. And she wasn't going to stop until the whole system changed. Danielle Carter sat in her car just outside the station, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The engine hummed softly, but the noise outside, the voices, the questions, the flashing cameras, felt louder than anything she'd experienced all night. She didn't move, not yet. She needed a moment to gather herself, to let the reality of what had just unfolded settle. Her phone buzzed against the console, snapping her out of her thoughts. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the screen to reveal a name she recognized immediately, Assistant Director Harper. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Agent Carter." His voice was sharp, controlled. "I just saw the footage." Danielle closed her eyes, her breath steadying. "I figured you would. You need to come in. We need to talk about what happens next." "Next?" Her voice carried an edge. "What happens next is he faces consequences. I want charges pressed. I want a full investigation." "And you'll have it," Harper replied. "But you need to tread carefully here. This case is already bigger than just you and Dawson. It's political now. You understand that?" Danielle opened her eyes and stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror. She didn't want to hear about politics. Not tonight. Not after everything. I understand, she said, but her tone was tight. I'll be there in an hour. She hung up before he could say anything else. By the time she walked back into the station, the atmosphere had shifted. The noise outside had quieted, but inside, the air felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Officers avoided her gaze as she made her way down the hall. Some whispered under their breath, and others simply froze when they saw her coming. Dawson's desk sat empty, his personal items already being cleared out by someone else. She felt no satisfaction seeing it that way, just a hollow sense of inevitability. He had brought this on himself, but she knew the fallout wouldn't end with him. The captain was waiting in his office, his expression unreadable. He motioned for her to sit, but she stayed standing. Agent Carter, he began carefully. We're working on the report now. Dawson's been suspended pending the investigation. I assume you'll be filing formal charges? Yes. Her voice was sharp, leaving no room for negotiation. The captain exhaled slowly. Look, I know you want blood right now, and I don't blame you. But you should know this department is already feeling the heat. We're going to cooperate fully, but I need to be clear, this isn't just about one officer. People are going to start digging, and I can't promise they'll like what they find. Danielle's jaw tightened. Maybe that's the point. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something there that almost looked like regret. Be careful, Agent Carter. Sometimes taking down one man exposes a system that's too big to fix. Danielle leaned in. Then maybe it's time someone tried. She turned and left without another word. Outside the office, Thompson stood awkwardly, his hands shoved in his pockets. He flinched when he saw her, but she didn't stop walking. Agent Carter, he called after her, his voice uncertain. She paused, glancing back. I wanted to say I'm sorry, he said, his words tumbling out too fast. I should have spoken up earlier. I knew what was happening wasn't right, and I froze. I let it happen. Danielle's eyes softened, but only slightly. You froze because you're afraid of what speaking up might cost you. That's the problem, Thompson. Fear lets people like Dawson keep their power. His shoulders sagged. What do I do now? Her voice softened just enough to be encouraging. You start by being better tomorrow than you were today. And then you keep doing it until it's not fear that controls you, it's integrity. He nodded quickly, but she didn't stay to see his reaction. She had bigger battles to fight. Later that night, Danielle sat in Harper's office, her badge resting on the desk between them. The weight of it suddenly felt heavier than it ever had before. The DOJ is going to push for a swift investigation, Harper said, his tone careful. But I need to know if you're ready for the attention this is going to bring. She met his gaze without hesitation. I'm ready. This isn't just about Dawson anymore. You're going to be a symbol now, for better or worse. People are going to dissect every decision you've made in your career. They're going to look for flaws, for weaknesses. You need to be prepared for that. Danielle's shoulders squared. Let them look. Harper nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair. Good. Because this doesn't end here. The department's under scrutiny now, and the pressure's only going to build. You'll have to decide how far you're willing to push. Danielle leaned forward. All the way. The room fell silent as Harper studied her face. Finally, he nodded. Then let's make sure we're ready. As Danielle left the office, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a news alert. The headline read, FBI agent wrongfully arrested, racial profiling investigation underway. She exhaled, knowing the world was already watching. Every word she said, every step she took from this point on, would be scrutinized. But for the first time in hours, she didn't feel powerless. She felt ready. What had started as a moment of humiliation was now a movement. And Danielle Carter wasn't about to let it stop until justice was served. Danielle Carter leaned back in her chair, her fingers tightening around the edge of the desk in Harper's office. The glow from the overhead light cast sharp shadows across the room, emphasizing the tension that hung between them. Her badge still rested in the center of the desk, its golden sheen reflecting the weight of the conversation they had just finished. She could feel Harper's eyes on her, measuring her resolve, but she didn't waver. "You're already a target," Harper said finally, breaking the silence. "This is only going to make that worse." Danielle exhaled slowly, her voice steady. "I don't care." "You should," he countered, leaning forward. "Because this isn't just about Dawson anymore. It's about the department. The system. The headlines already have your face plastered everywhere, and the DOJ is coming down hard. That's pressure most people can't handle." Danielle's jaw tightened. "I've handled worse." Harper studied her for a moment longer before sitting back. "I know you have. But this is different. They're not just questioning Dawson, they're questioning everyone, including you." She met his gaze without hesitation. "Let them. I didn't do anything wrong. And you think that matters?" His voice sharpened. "Perception matters, Carter. And right now, this case is a powder keg. One wrong step, and it's going to explode. Are you ready for that?" Danielle's voice dropped, steady and deliberate. "I've been ready since the moment he put his hands on me." Harper's eyes softened just slightly, but he nodded. "Then let's make sure you're covered. I'll get the legal team involved. Whatever happens next, you won't face it alone." She nodded, standing as she reached for her badge. But before she could leave, Harper's voice stopped her. "Carter." She turned. "Don't let this destroy you." Her fingers tightened around the badge. "It won't." The walk out of the building felt heavier this time. Danielle's footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway, the faint hum of office equipment and whispered conversations barely registering in her mind. When she stepped outside, the night air hit her, cool and sharp. A group of reporters lingered near the entrance, their cameras snapping the second they spotted her. She didn't stop, pushing through the crowd without saying a word. "Agent Carter, do you feel vindicated after Dawson's suspension? Do you think this will lead to more investigations into racial profiling? Are you worried about retaliation from other officers?" That last question made her pause. She turned, her eyes locking on the reporter who had asked it. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not." Before they could throw another question, she walked away, leaving their voices trailing behind her. When she reached her car, her phone buzzed again. Another news alert. Protests planned after FBI agent's arrest sparks national outrage. Danielle swallowed hard. She had expected fallout, but this? This was bigger than she'd anticipated. And it wasn't slowing down. Her phone rang, pulling her attention back. She glanced at the screen, an unfamiliar number, but answered anyway. "Danielle Carter." "You don't know me," the voice on the other end said quickly. It was a woman, her tone nervous. "But I saw what happened to you. And I need your help." Danielle straightened, the tension in her shoulders returning instantly. "Who is this?" "My name's Maria," the woman said. "And my son, he's in trouble. The police picked him up last night. They're saying he resisted arrest, but that's not true. He's scared." "I'm scared." Danielle's breath caught. This wasn't the first call she'd gotten like this. People saw her face on the news and thought she could fix what was broken. She wanted to. God, she wanted to. But the weight of it all was starting to press harder against her chest. "Maria, I'm not a defense attorney." "I can't, but you know what it's like," Maria interrupted, her voice cracking. You know what they do. Please. Danielle closed her eyes. Where is he? The woman gave her the address, and Danielle wrote it down before hanging up. She sat there for a moment, staring at the paper. She knew what this meant, getting involved, putting herself out there again. But she also knew she couldn't walk away. Not now. When she arrived at the station, it was déjà vu. The same walls. The same tired faces. But this time, Danielle wasn't the one in cuffs. She walked through the halls with purpose, the weight of her badge resting firmly against her hip. An officer met her at the desk, his expression guarded. Can I help you? I'm here for David Alvarez, she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. The officer hesitated, then gestured toward the back. Third cell. Danielle followed him, her heart pounding as they approached. When the officer unlocked the door, she saw him, a teenage boy, no older than 16, sitting on the bench with his head down. David, she said softly. His head snapped up, and his eyes widened. Are you the lady from the news? She stepped inside, nodding. I'm here to help. Tears welled up in his eyes as he stood, his shoulders shaking. They said I hit the cop, but I didn't. I swear I didn't. Danielle knelt in front of him, meeting his eyes. We're going to fix this. But I need you to trust me, okay? He nodded quickly, wiping his face. As she stood and turned back to the officer, her voice hardened. Get him out of here. Now. The officer hesitated. I'll need clearance, you have it, she snapped. Call Harper if you need confirmation. The officer moved quickly, and as Danielle watched, she felt the weight on her shoulders shift. She had started this fight for herself, but now it was bigger than her. It was about everyone who didn't have the voice to stand up. And she wasn't done. Not even close. Danielle Carter stood just outside the police station, the weight of the night settling deeper into her chest. The streetlights buzzed faintly overhead, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. She gripped her phone tightly, the screen still glowing with messages and missed calls. Reporters lingered near the edge of the parking lot, their cameras lowered for now but ready to snap back into place the moment she made another move. David Alvarez and his mother, Maria, stood nearby. Maria kept a protective arm wrapped around her son's shoulders, her eyes darting nervously toward the officers who occasionally stepped in and out of the building. David clung to her, his face still pale, his hands trembling despite the warm night air. Are we free to go? Maria asked, her voice shaky but determined. Danielle turned toward the officer who had been handling David's release. He stood near the door, holding a clipboard, but the nervous flick of his pen betrayed his unease. You're free to go, the officer said, but his voice lacked conviction. Are you sure about that? Danielle stepped forward, her eyes locked on his. Because I need it in writing. Official documentation, no outstanding charges, no conditions. I want to make sure no one comes knocking on their door tomorrow pretending this isn't settled. The officer hesitated, his eyes shifting toward the window where his supervisor stood watching. I need a minute. You've had plenty of minutes, Danielle shot back. Get it done now. Maria's grip on her son tightened as the officer hurried back inside. Danielle turned to her, her voice softening. He's safe now, she said, but Maria's eyes filled with tears. They said he resisted, Maria whispered. They said he shoved the officer and tried to run. But he didn't. I know he didn't. Danielle crouched slightly to meet David's eyes. Tell me exactly what happened. David swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. I was walking home from my friend's house. I had my headphones in, and I didn't hear them at first. When they yelled, I turned around, and one of them was already coming at me. He grabbed me and pushed me up against the car. I told him I didn't do anything, but he said I was lying. Danielle's stomach tightened. And then they searched my bag, pulled everything out right there on the street. People were watching, and I didn't know what to do. His voice broke, and Maria pulled him closer. Danielle stood slowly, her hands curling into fists at her sides. I know what that feels like, she said softly, but there was steel beneath her words. And I promise you, this isn't over. The officer returned, this time holding a manila folder. He handed it to Danielle without looking her in the eye. All charges dropped. It's official. Danielle flipped through the pages, double-checking every line before nodding and handing it to Maria. Keep this safe. Maria clutched the folder like it was a lifeline. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you so much. Danielle nodded, but her focus had already shifted back to the officer. Who arrested him? The officer hesitated. I can't disclose that. Danielle's eyes narrowed. You don't want me to find out on my own. Agent Carter, don't, she cut him off. Because I will find out. And when I do, you'd better hope your name isn't anywhere near the paperwork. The officer stepped back, clearly rattled, and Danielle turned to Maria. Go home. Make sure he rests, and if anyone contacts you about this, call me immediately. Maria nodded, tears still streaming down her face as she guided David toward their car. Danielle watched them leave before pulling out her phone and dialing Harper's number. He answered on the first ring. Tell me you're not still at the station. They tried to bury another one, Danielle said, pacing now. 16 years old, Harper. They were ready to throw his life away without a second thought. There was a long pause before Harper replied. You can't fix every broken piece of this system. Maybe not, Danielle snapped. But I'm damn sure not going to sit back and let it keep breaking people. Harper exhaled. What do you need? I need names. The officers involved, their records, complaints, everything. You know this isn't going to make you any more popular. I'm not here to make friends. Harper's voice softened. Be careful, Carter. You're poking a hornet's nest, and there are people in this city who don't want it stirred. Danielle's jaw tightened. Then they'd better brace themselves. She hung up and leaned against her car, letting the weight of the night settle in for just a moment. She could already feel the storm brewing, internal affairs, press conferences, angry statements from unions, but none of it mattered. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about David. About Maria. About every name and face that didn't make it into the headlines. Her phone buzzed again, another notification lighting up the screen. The video of her confrontation with Dawson had hit over 1 million views. The comments were flooding in, some supportive, some angry, some dismissive. Danielle stared at the screen, her reflection faintly visible behind the words. She didn't have time to process it. Not yet. A voice startled her. Agent Carter. She turned to see Thompson standing near the entrance of the station, his face pale but determined. What is it? He swallowed hard. I just wanted you to know, I filed a report against Dawson. Danielle raised an eyebrow. You did? He nodded. It's not much, but I couldn't keep quiet anymore. Not after tonight. For the first time in hours, Danielle felt a flicker of hope. Good, she said. Now don't stop. Thompson nodded, and as he turned to go back inside, Danielle allowed herself a brief moment to breathe. The fight wasn't over. Not even close. But for the first time, she felt like the tide was starting to turn. And she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The courtroom was packed. Rows of spectators filled the seats, their eyes locked on the front of the room where Danielle Carter stood tall, her sharp suit crisp and commanding. The energy buzzed with anticipation, a hum of whispers and muffled conversations echoing through the space. Cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking as they recorded every movement, every glance. Rick Dawson sat at the defendant's table, his hands folded tightly, knuckles white against the polished wood. He looked smaller than before, his shoulders no longer squared, his eyes darting nervously as though searching for an escape. The uniform was gone, replaced by a simple suit that did little to hide the sweat beading at his temples. Danielle didn't look at him. She kept her gaze forward, focused on the judge as he cleared his throat and shuffled the papers in front of him. Her pulse was steady, her breathing controlled. She had prepared for this moment. All rise. The room obeyed, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor as the judge entered. Everyone settled quickly, and the proceedings began. The prosecution laid out the evidence in precise detail, the unlawful arrest, the use of force, the racial bias. The video played again, this time on a large screen for the jury. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the footage showed Dawson shoving Danielle, slamming her against the hood of the car, the cuffs tightening around her wrists. Dawson's defense lawyer tried to paint a different picture, a man who made an honest mistake, who let his instincts guide him in a situation that escalated too quickly. But Danielle had anticipated every angle. When it was her turn to speak, she stood with purpose. "I've spent my entire career defending the law," she began, her voice calm but resolute. "But what happened to me wasn't about the law. It was about power, misused, abused, and unchecked. I was humiliated, treated like a criminal, not because of my actions but because of assumptions. And while I had the resources and the badge to fight back, too many others don't." Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. She let the silence stretch before continuing. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has ever been targeted, silenced, or ignored. It's about the systems that protect people like Officer Dawson while leaving others vulnerable. And today, I'm asking this court to hold him accountable, not just for what he did to me but for what he represents." She sat down, her heart pounding, but her face betrayed none of it. The verdict came quickly. Guilty. The word rang out, final and absolute. Dawson's shoulders collapsed as the judge listed the charges: unlawful arrest, excessive force, abuse of authority. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, but Danielle knew his life would never be the same. As Dawson was led out in handcuffs, the same cuffs he had used on her, he glanced back one last time. His eyes were hollow, defeated. Danielle didn't look away. She held his gaze until the door closed behind him. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted. Reporters swarmed, microphones and cameras thrust forward. But Danielle didn't stop to answer questions. She walked straight to Maria and David, who stood waiting near the steps. Maria hugged her tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You did it," she whispered. Danielle pulled back slightly, resting her hands on Maria's shoulders. "We did it." David stepped closer, his eyes no longer filled with fear but with something stronger, hope. "Thank you," he said quietly. Danielle smiled, ruffling his hair. "Don't thank me yet. This fight isn't over." As the crowd pressed closer, Harper appeared, pulling her aside. "You made headlines again," he said with a small smile. Danielle shook her head. "Good. Maybe this time, people will listen." Harper's smile faded. "What's next for you?" Danielle looked out at the sea of faces, some cheering, some crying, some simply watching. The weight of their expectations settled on her shoulders, but this time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like purpose. "I keep fighting," she said. "For them." And with that, she stepped forward, ready for whatever came next. This story is more than just one woman's fight for justice. It's about power, accountability, and what happens when those in authority abuse their positions. It's about how assumptions and prejudice can ruin lives, and how courage, resilience, and truth can set them right. But it also leaves us with questions we can't ignore. How many others have faced what Danielle faced, but without the resources to fight back? How many names and faces have been lost in the cracks of a broken system? And what will it take to change that? Danielle's story reminds us that injustice doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it's quiet, subtle, disguised as routine. And if we're not paying attention, we let it grow. So what will you do the next time you see injustice? Will you speak up? Will you step in? Or will you look the other way? Think about that. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something, anger, hope, frustration, don't let that feeling fade. Share it. Talk about it. Be part of the change. Thank you for watching this story from Tales of Twist. If you enjoyed it, if it made you think, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What did you feel while hearing this story? What would you have done in Danielle's place? And remember, justice starts with awareness. Let's keep the conversation going. See you next time.